Hi, and welcome back to the MD, PhD, etc. series on masculine psychology, or the magic of the masculine mind. And if you saw the last lecture, I talked largely about the biology of masculine evolution, how masculine ideas and behaviors may have been faced and shaped by biological forces. So this time we're going to talk about socialization, how society pressured us into particular forms of the masculine ideal. And if you're talking about this in the West, you really can't do so without talking about Sparta.
This is Sparta!
So it may come as a surprise to absolutely no one that Hollywood's portrayal of Sparta or Greeks or history or anything is not 100% accurate. For example, Spartans probably didn't go into battle wearing nothing but a cloak. They would wear armor, clothing, same as anyone else. But that actual idea that the men would wear just cloaks actually does come from somewhere in Spartan history. And that's from the way that they raised their boys, from the agoge. So agoge has been translated variously as the way, the upbringing, or leadership, depending on which translator you believe most. It's probably a blend. But it was the Spartan structured way of bringing up boys, specifically boys, to become warriors, the homine, or the equals, the members of society who contributed to the way that Spartan society worked. And again, the reason we go back to this is it shaped so much of Western thinking, as Greek thinking in general shaped Western thinking. If you look at Western thinking in general, the two biggest influences sort of synthesized in St. Augustine are Greek philosophy, Greek ideals, and eventually the Bible coming out of Hebrew traditions. So again, for masculine formation, the idea of what a man should be, this idea that the Spartans had of the agoge has been imitated again and again, overtly sometimes. The Romans completely imitated this with some modifications, calling their youth schools and military training academies the agoge. And you see this in Prussian academies, which again also imitated this. And even in modern forms, things like the Spartan race, of course, that we still see as these ways of proving your masculinity, or perhaps improving your masculinity by certain trials and tribulations. The idea that struggle, that overcoming the tribulation was how a man is made. So, interestingly, the movie shows something that is accurate. Leonidas went through the agoge, the traditional Spartan upbringing. And this started even at birth, that male infants were inspected to see if they were considered to have any sort of flaws. And if they were left out for the wild animals. They were also bathed in wine, which was viewed not so much as we think of like a baptism, but again, it was a test. Could they survive this? And this echoes, again, the biological idea that we've seen earlier, that there is a little bit more selection pressure on males. Males are generally viewed as more disposable in biology, for mammals at least, and that this then got echoed and reinforced in society, particularly in this Spartan version of things. But what's interesting in terms of the historical reflection here is that Leonidas, the king of Sparta, who was famous for the battle at Thermopylae and the 300, would not normally have gone through the agoge, because if you knew you were going to be king, you were exempted from this particular training. Kings had a different profession. They had a different thing that they needed to learn, where the agoge was meant to form the base, the society of equals of men, the homine. So what was actually involved in the agoge, the upbringing? What did they do with children? Well, boys were removed from their families at 7 years of age and brought into a communal setting where they have to be entirely dependent on each other and their senior mentors. They were really very much asked to fend for themselves, put in some cases literally against the elements. this idea of fighting wild animals that was in 300 is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration. A lot of the struggles were against society. For example, again, the cloak thing that the Spartan warriors are shown as in that movie. Spartans did wear red cloaks, but they would have worn armor. But children, boys specifically, were given only the cloak. And that's because they were expected to fend with a minimal amount of resources. Specifically, they were expected to either hunt or steal their food. Now, stealing, by the way, still wasn't sanctioned in general in Spartan society. A boy who got caught would be harshly punished for stealing his food or food for his comrades even. But the idea was that it was intended to build cunning, to build the skill to outwit your opponents, even when the opponents were the society themselves at this point. And the training was not entirely military. They did the things that you would expect a military training academy to do: hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, skills in terms of shaping and maintaining your armor and weapons. But there was also aspects of learning rhetoric, particularly a style of being laconic, of using brief, pithy phrases to communicate. The phrase comes from a particular Spartan king who responded to an invasion threat against the Spartans, where the foreign king said, if I defeat your city, I am going to burn it to the ground, kill everyone, rape your women, destroy everything. So you should surrender now. And King responded with one word: if. And the Spartans took this to be awesome, that this was the way that a man was supposed to be to communicate in brief but direct ways. And within there as well, that they were taught to read, to write, learn poetry and dance, because a lot of the culture was considered embedded in this. And the skills to be a Spartan were not entirely based in being a warrior. This was the core component of the homine, of the equals, was being a warrior. As the clip again from the movie 300 shows.
A handful of soldiers against Xerxes? You see, I was wrong to expect Sparta's commitment to at least match our own.
Doesn't it? You, there. What is your profession?
I'm a potter.
And you, Arcadian. What is your profession?
Sculptor, sir.
You?
Blacksmith.
Spartans! What is your profession? See, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
To be a warrior was your profession. And this will tie in closely as well to male education going on, about how societies, not going forward from the Spartans, but many unrelated to it, will shape males into a particular role. And we'll talk about how that differed from the role of women in Spartan society and across the board in a second. But so a boy would start out at 7, would again be given a minimal amount of resources, one garment, essentially no food, be mentored, but also expected to develop a leadership role as he went along. A select group of the agoge would be selected for a sort of secret police that would eventually enforce rules upon society as a whole, and an even more select group could in fact be chosen for the royal guard, what are portrayed as the 300 in the movie. So how did this differ from upbringing for women or girls in Sparta? Sparta, as the name implies, was Spartan. The things were harsh and minimalistic across the board, and that applied to women too. Women were just as tough as the men in a lot of ways. But again, they weren't shaped into this specific role, and they weren't weeded out in the same way. Sparta was somewhat unusual in the Greek world, at least, in that it actually did train women to read, to write, to communicate. But their role was viewed as more universal, that a girl was brought up with the idea that pretty much anything she could do in Spartan society, just to have children, if that's all she could do, but also whether she cooked or cleaned or hunted, or in cases of dire emergency, served as warriors. And there were famous Spartan female warriors, as there were in many societies. But with the Spartans, it was a matter of last resort, as it is in many societies, because the women were not viewed as disposable in the same way, where they weren't viewed as cannon fodder or spear fodder or arrow fodder, more appropriate to the times. When you saw female warriors, it was more, say, it was a warrior queen, someone who was at a leadership position, and therefore she had to be intellectually trained for a wide variety of options. But for the men, they were weeded out if they couldn't serve this role. Again, the sort of person who turns out to be critical to all this, but because he couldn't fit in to the particular role in Spartan society as a boy was weeded out, was excluded, because you had to be shaped into a particular profession. And for most Spartans, the king accepted, and some other roles like priest and prophet accepted, was usually as a warrior. The way that you built warriors, of course, was by a constant process of deprivation, toughening, and selection. And that there were certain rites, rituals, tasks that had to be overcome. Going back to, if you saw my very first lecture, the Marine Corps commercial very much plays into that idea that manhood had to be something that was earned through specific forms of overcoming and deprivation. But interestingly, is this just Sparta? Is all of our ideas of masculinity, whether you view that as positive or negative or toxic or whatever, is this all going back to a very patriarchal society in Sparta and then mixed with some other things along the way? By no means. Carl Jung talked about the warrior as one of the archetypes that seems to reappear throughout society. This has not just shown up in Spartan society. It showed up in many societies that were completely divorced, who had no cultural connection to Sparta whatsoever. Now, of course, Carl Jung is incredibly important, so the idea of archetypes and masculine archetypes included, but wasn't exactly a structured scientific thinker. He went basically on what he observed just around him. But modern research has backed this up. The anthropologist David Gilmour, who's written a great book, by the way, called Manhood in the Making, had a quote that I like. Quote, "There is a constantly recurring notion that real manhood is different from simple anatomical maleness, that it is not a natural condition that comes about spontaneously through biological maturation, but rather is a precarious or artificial state that boys must win against powerful odds." And he cites a wide variety of cultural experiences where this happens, starting with the fact that circumcision is such a common practice across the globe, but particularly in Central African tribes. Now, most of us here in the West perhaps think of the Hebrew tradition as doing this in infancy and just sort of a way of marking cultural inclusion and perhaps some hygiene reasons. But in a lot of tribes, it's a ritual of pain. It's done in adolescence, where there's a lot of nerve endings in there, and it bleeds vastly more than it does in an infant. So a boy must endure this and not flinch in the face of basically, what's the worst pain I can think of inflicting on you, that specifically ties into your concept of manhood and masculinity, and you've got to be able to endure that to pass this ritual to get through. This idea that pain is involved, that this deprivation, similar to the Spartans or the painful ritual, is again very common across different cultures. That we see tattooing, scarification, very common in coming of age ceremonies. Some of these are used to show that the boy is ready for combat. In other cultures, the pain itself appears to be the point. For the Mawe tribe in the Brazilian Amazon, they will specifically take 13-year-old boys and have them make this glove in which they sew in bullet ants, which as the name implies, are their sting is so painful that it's felt to feel like a bullet. It's generally felt to be the second most painful insect after, I think, those killer hornets that made the news recently, or death hornets. But incredibly, incredibly painful, and they're expected to put on a glove made of these things and just endure it multiple times in a row without flinching. And then you can see things that are more like a test, like, for example, the Aboriginal tribes of Australia. Many of them send their young men or boys on walkabout, which is where they have to cross thousands of miles on their own, with essentially no resources, and are expected to be able to navigate, to hunt, to accomplish all these things. And when they finally finish their walkabout, that is only when they can be considered a man. Some of these involve practical skills. There's a lot of hunting rituals. Yay, I was able to show that I can prove my worth by bringing back the animal that I've hunted. But often the difficulty itself seems to be part of the process. We see this a lot in fishing cultures in particular, where the rite of passage into manhood involves going out in the boat or just swimming or diving or whatever. But it's not the volume of fish that the young man is complimented on or achieves his manhood through, but rather the difficulty of what he accomplished in this, that you dove the deepest to get the fish, you went into the coldest water, that you, again, went through some sort of ritual to achieve manhood, is something that appears in a wide variety of cultures. Now, a lot of people will, of course, jump in here and think, well, was that really specific to men and boys in terms of these painful initiation ceremonies, that tattooing is by no means something that is specific to men across a wide variety of cultures. And there are other things that can be quite painful for women, foot binding, neck stretching of the Kenyan giraffe women, as they're the Kayan giraffe women of Myanmar, you may have seen from National Geographic. So obviously that looks pretty painful and is part of the female ritual. But in these rituals, usually the point is to actually make someone aesthetically more pleasing. So the tattoos or the neck stretching or the foot binding is actually considered attractive. Whereas the rituals for males are often viewed as being unattractive, overtly ugly. You see this, say, in the Prussian tradition of mensar, or barrel fencing, in which there would be these fraternities, and as part of the initiation, they would cut at each other with sabers while sitting in a barrel so they couldn't move or run away. They would wear goggles to protect the eyes, but you were expected to get cuts on both cheeks, and they would actually then rub sand and dirt in there to make them as ugly as possible, because it showed your toughness, even though people would say that this was not attractive, not in the aesthetic sense anyway. So again, for men, the initiation, the pain and the suffering seem to sort of be the point, even though for women, again, I'm not minimizing women's or girls' pain. Obviously, childbirth, women go through as much or more pain than men, but it doesn't seem to be part of the acculturation that we want girls to experience pain the way that we seem to want boys to experience pain, to say that they need to experience that in order to toughen up and to become men. So going back to David Gilmour again for a minute, here's another quote from him. There is a recurrent notion that manhood is problematic, a critical threshold that boys must pass through testing that is found at all levels of socio-cultural development, regardless of what alternative roles are recognized. Conversely, an authentic femininity rarely involves tests or proofs of action, rather than a critical threshold passed by traumatic testing, an either-or condition. Femininity is more often constructed as a biological given that is culturally refined or augmented through these sort of things. So again, it's not so much a test, it's not so much a shaping as it's an enhancement. The cultures for girls, this upbringing is thought to make them pretty in a lot of ways. So stepping away from just the pain and testing aspect for a minute, I want to go back to this idea that the agoge was specifically intended to shape boys into warriors or to the secret police or into leaders. That schooling for boys, upbringing for boys, was much about tying them into a particular job or profession. By the way, a quick distinction on that. Well, often we use the term professional these days to mean sort of anyone whose job is sort of intense. I'm going to do this job for the rest of my life. But it really, the word implied that there was a certain code that went through, that you were professing something about that. They say in modern society, the only three true professions are physician. Due to the Hippocratic Oath, we have a certain ethos that we swear to, lawyers who similarly swear to a certain code of conduct, and various religious entities, priests, rabbis, etc. But you see this idea that, again, that boys are shaped into jobs that become their identity as part of their upbringing across the board. Even within warrior culture, there's a refinement of this. For example, the U.S. Military Academy was founded with a specific purpose of forming military engineers. The reason that young men needed to be educated in math and other things that we would now think of as STEM was that there was a shortage of military engineers. So we needed to form boys into this particular role in society. And you saw this in apprenticeships throughout the world, various academies. The oldest schools for writing, for example, in ancient Egypt, were specifically to train scribes. The idea that reading and writing was something for more general improvement was something that came later and was not used so much to shape girls as boys as they were trained for a particular job. And you could say that's because women were excluded from the workplace in a lot of ways, but nevertheless, this idea that the acculturation that is common across the world for males involves the idea that job work becomes identity. To this day, women in the United States now achieve more degrees than men. But if you look at the things that specifically funnel into particular jobs, STEM being the most obvious, that men are still more likely to go into those fields, whereas women are more likely to study broader topics such as liberal arts, communications, and things like that. Again, could bias be involved in that? Definitely. But it also seems that the more free the society is, the Scandinavian countries are often viewed as being the most progressive when it comes to female inclusion. They have laws on the books that a certain percentage of the legislature has to be female, that there's a number of protections for women. Generally, the most female positive societies in the world. And yet, as societies become more open to freedom and women have more choice, this actually gets exaggerated, that the freer the society, the more likely it seems that males will go into schooling and training that is aimed at particular jobs, whereas women will study more broadly. If you're in a poor country and you're a young girl, you may need to support the family. So really that's an absolute necessity that you need to train to bring in money. But when women are given the choice, that again, the idea that for men, you still need to be shaped into your profession as your identity, even if that's not as a warrior, if that's not the archetype. You're still trained into your job. So I don't think I need to belabor the idea too much that men and boys are sent towards schooling and socialized more to think of their job as part of their identity. I think that's fairly obvious from things like the fact that 95% of trade school graduates are male, despite, again, for something like college, where the majority are now female. But going back to how much of this Spartan idea, the idea of deprivation of testing, has percolated into modern society, I want to get back to. Because obviously the Spartans were an extreme example. Even back in Greek and Roman days, the Spartans were viewed as extreme in terms of the way that they treated people. I certainly wasn't beaten up as a child or expected to fight off wild animals. People have said that the concept of bullying as being part of what was necessary to become a boy, to become a man, was percolated from this. That was present in British private schools. Even when I was growing up, again, nerds were traditionally thought of as going through a ritual of bullying. Thankfully, that's going away, but did it have a purpose? This was a funny little clip from Shameless that I thought was interesting in terms of the role of bullying in society.
Spare us the Wiener Act. Bullying is a vital part of every ecosystem. It teaches kids resilience. The world is a rough place. Bullying is like getting inoculated. It's a vaccine. And you little shits, you gotta learn to stay away from people like my son. That's what you learn when you get punched in the face by a bully. How do you think Steve Jobs turned out so great? Bullies. And I guarantee Junior here will be getting the hottest chicks when he's 30 because he got bullied today. You want your kid to peak now? My kid will be picking up roadside garbage in an orange jumpsuit in 10 years. Your kid will be in med school, curing cancer and getting laid. You're welcome.
So I mentioned earlier that clearly there are certain rites of passage or tests or male enhancing ceremonies or tests that are done today, like the Spartan race or Spartan boot camp that you see over the place. But I want to talk about one particular example with which I have some familiarity, not because I went through it personally, but having spent 20 years with the Navy. And this is a phenomenon that has occurred not just in military navies, but has now spread to things that we often think of as sort of liberal bastions and against ideas of particular masculine rituals and that sort of thing. You'll see it on research vessels. And this is the concept of the crossing the line ceremony, when an individual first crosses the equator under sail on a ship, that they go through a ritual that initiates them into the process of becoming a shellback, hardening, right? That allows you to be accepted into the wider variety of sailors. And there's an overtly Greek theme in this, a reference to the Greek god Poseidon over and over again. And that the ritual humiliation and pain is necessary for graduation into this status. I found an interesting blog called Life at Sea by Mr. Bhattacharjee, I think it's pronounced. And he describes in detail this process in the following way. The polywog, junior person, also referred to as a landlubber, must be dipped in water for the initiation and passed into the realm of the seas. This part is the beginning of the ritual, wherein they are stripped down to their underwear or nothing, and normally dipped in the water gathered in the save-all tray. Following the dip, raw eggs are broken onto the heads of the first-timers, and then they are made to drink a deadly concoction of beer, chili sauce, raw eggs, etc. The reason behind this is to give the beginners a truth serum in order that they speak the absolute truth when they swear their allegiance to King Neptune and the sea. Then the heads are shaved in the most uneven manner possible. No historical reasoning for it, perhaps judging it is most likely to do with a purging process, and paint is applied at random all over the body. Having endured such privations, Bhattacharjee goes on to describe what happens when the ceremony is survived. King Neptune goes to make an earnest speech and accepts the ushering of the sailor into the sea under the auspices of Her Majesty. The scepter is laid forth to mark this moment of truth. Following this aspect of this grand event, the sailors are all tied together and march forward to the anchor with the sound of a drum to coordinate movement. Again, this is now a cross-cultural phenomenon across the world. It's been reproduced in navies from the Spanish Armada to Darwin's scientific voyage on the Beagle. There's reference to this in his diary. Franklin Delano Roosevelt crossing of the equator on the Indianapolis notes this ceremony. Although reviled by some intellectuals and is an ongoing instrument of the patriarchy, it's a toned-down version, again, often includes women and sort of confers a masculine role on women by going through this. Obviously, the references to Neptune and other things clearly trace back to the Greeks, if not to the Spartans specifically. Now, the view that this is just to make sailors, or perhaps masculine sailors, but even out of women, is something that is the Navy's official sort of go-to line on this. Here's a quote from a salty boatswain's mate named Bernard Dizon, officially out of the Navy press office in 2004. Quote, "It was designed to test the novices in the crew to see whether they could endure their first cruise at sea." So thought of this to be sort of a practical initiation. But some have suspected that there's a darker nature to this. Again, the concept of toxic masculinity. So looking for a moment at that perspective, there's another anthropology professor, Carrie Hirsch, who wrote a 2002 paper, quote, "Crossing the Line, Sex, Power, Justice, and the U.S. Navy at the Equator." And this is what she said about it. "What is so fascinating about the ritual is the power that it wields. The power comes in several forms. Internally, the drama of the ceremony aids in the manifestation and affirmation of deeply rooted beliefs about gender roles, sex, and domination. The drama itself contains much power as the brutality, beatings, and humiliations are not only permitted but encouraged as tools of transformation." Skipping a little bit. "The uninitiated are physically and psychologically tested by the initiates until they are proven acceptable. Throughout the ritual, the initiated take the male position and the uninitiated take the female position. As the uninitiated become initiated, they assume a masculine identity that is defined in relation to the feminine characters which are portrayed. At the end, all participants embody the particular positive male qualities of the initiated and become members of the great fraternal order of the ranging man under the great leader of, again, another male figure, King Neptune." So I find this idea fascinating for a couple of reasons. I'm not necessarily agreeing with Professor Hirsch in this, by the way, but her perspective, again, casts something about the view of males in general. There's nothing inherently masculine in the name of the superior position, shellback, or feminine in the female, polywog. I couldn't tell if a shell was male or female, but it's assumed that polywog represents an unmarried woman in female sexual power that must be dominated and transformed into a shellback's masculine power and self-control. And according to her, this in turn betrays a deeper belief that female essence is inherent, such as in sexuality, and that can only be degraded by testing, whereas for men, the masculinity can only be achieved through this tribulation. So even in criticizing it, Professor Hirsch is sort of reinforcing this idea that masculinity is something that is shaped, is formed, is created by tribulation and through training, whereas again, femininity is viewed as something more inherent, and that appears across a number of cultures, but is particularly reinforced within warrior culture. So let's look at this again in a modern and less severe form. So there was a 2006 study by Frank Merkett and Kevin Wedall that looked at the ways that teachers in regular everyday schools praise or criticize boys and girls in a mixed classroom. And overall, boys and girls actually performed about the same when it came to maintaining their academics and behaving well in class. Boys, however, elicited both more praise and more criticism. Now, there was a gendered aspect to this, that female teachers were more likely to do the criticizing of boys, whereas male teachers were more likely to do the praising of boys. But as a whole, boys got the feedback that they were told repeatedly they had to be shaped into whether their behavior was right or wrong, despite the fact that when you looked objectively at the behavior, the boys were not acting out more, nor were they more likely to be doing the best, but they were likely to be given specific feedback to shape their behaviors to say, you're doing wrong or you're doing right. Now we get to formal research on adults. It gets much messier because obviously people are aware that they're being watched and probably alter their behavior in response to that. But the idea that men are more likely to get direct feedback in their roles, both in sort of a positive and negative way, does seem to be a fairly universal truth. There's been a lot of criticisms that women are not mentored in the same way as men are in their jobs. And the idea that a female supervisor would sort of be passively aggressive towards their female subordinates is almost so universal that I don't know if we need research to back up that idea. That we know that even when women are in leadership positions, though, that there is clear data that, again, they're less likely to mentor junior females than a male in a superior position is likely to mentor a junior male and to provide them specific feedback, both positive and negative. Now, this may grow out of some legitimate fears in both directions. For a woman receiving feedback, is that feedback, particularly from a male supervisor, really intended to improve work? There have been many surveys. There's one that I looked at published on Zeddy.com that said 75% of women report that they have been hit on by a colleague or a manager in the workplace. And 33% report this came in the form of frequent compliments. So when a boss was praising a woman's work, it wasn't always clear that that criticism or praise was meant towards actually reinforcing the work, but rather intended in some ways to either punish the woman for her role in society, criticism, or to seduce her in some way. Again, to look at her value that was separate from the job. Whereas for the up and down the chain, the idea that sexuality or other things were used for the purpose of the job, going the other way around. So in the case of women, job-related praise was often focused on perhaps a deeper motive of sexuality. Whereas for men, if you look, there's a stereotype of women sleeping their way to the top. But if you actually survey people, men are more likely to say that they slept with a boss specifically for the purpose of promotion than women are. So for men, sexuality is a way of achieving the job-related goal, whereas for women, the job often impacts their sexuality. And bottom line is that there is a constant molding of males towards a particular job, a particular profession, and a particularly, perhaps more accurate sense of feedback. That women cannot be criticized in the workplace as much for fear that you take it personally in some way, that there will be a report, that this will be felt to be a form of an attack on a woman. And that actually in some ways ends up hurting women because it means that women don't get the sort of honest feedback that men do, and that may shape a number of ideas about how we think about masculine psychology. I should add one little caveat there, again, just about the concept of sleeping with your boss. That did occur in the context that both men and women are equally likely to sleep with their boss, but men were more likely to say that they did it for promotion. Interesting fact. So what do we see about in general, at least in Western societies, about socialization? That again, for boys, not all go to the extremes of the Spartan, but that idea that boys must be trained, must go through a particular ritual, must go through deprivation, must be guided into their masculinity and into a particular useful role in society, that they can fail this, that they may be excluded. Again, you look at something like prison populations, we look at both the top and bottom of society, that the top tends to be dominated by males, but also the bottom, that if you did not achieve this role, that many more times men end up as homeless, as in prisons, as you needed to be shaped and tested into this role, is an idea that again seems to be at least fairly prevalent. Now, is it universal? Absolutely not. The thing about looking at biology versus socialization is presumably socialization, conscious choices can be made to shape societies, and not all societies are hyper masculine for sure in the way the Spartans were. Again, the Scandinavian countries are quite egalitarian. Has there been the overt opposite at any point? Has there been societies which are really dominated by females? There was an idea, particularly in 19th century scholarship, that this was the way that civilization started, that the societies used to be matriarchal, used to worship a female earth goddess, and that women used to run things, maybe even were the warriors. The Amazonian cultures, existed where women were the primary hunters and warriors, and that at some point, that with more modern civilization, that masculinity began to exert itself in a way that destroyed the goddess and destroyed these pre-civilization societies that were driven by matriarchal values. Modern anthropologists don't put a whole lot of stock in this. As much as we've looked, there have been definitely more egalitarian societies, ones in which even children are raised in a very gender-neutral way. We'll get to that in a moment. But the idea that a society exists in which women completely dominate and fulfill those warrior roles doesn't seem to have been the case. There have been individual warrior queens in particular, again, in this leadership role, in the non-disposable role. And many societies have used women as warriors, sort of particularly, rather than let their society get destroyed. They may have filled niche roles as warriors. For example, in the Crow, the scouts and the torturers were often female. So gender-neutral societies. Their anthropologists love these because they say really interesting things about nature versus nurture. Starting with one in Samoa, there is a tradition of, I'm going to write the word up here because I cannot pronounce it to save my life. I've tried to look up how it's actually said. Fine, maybe. I don't know. I can't find something to say that out loud. But it literally translates as in the manner of women. And what this means is that in Samoan families in which there was already an abundance of boys, but not enough girls to help the mother, one or more male children would be designated into this category. These children raised in the manner of women. The biologically male children were brought up to do stereotypically women's work, and then were dressed and brought up as girls. In more modern times, these individuals seem to self-select, often chosen from individuals who would, in Western thinking, be thought of as transgendered or at least homosexual. Traditionally, however, in the older society, the decision was arbitrary, that people could transition back, that the individuals in this category ended up marrying women as adults, and often transitioned into more stereotypically male roles, serving as warriors or even chiefs. So this did imply that, again, even in societies in which biological boys, could be socialized as women, that the society still viewed the biological as pretty important, because this was not a society that really endorsed the concept of a female chief. Now, there's a lot of potential distortions in this. How this worked in pre-colonial society, our view of this is really possibly been manipulated to fit a particular narrative by some early researchers in the field. And there's the obvious fact that these kids would have always been recognized as biologically male, and thus there may not have been a true gender-neutral upbringing. And this, by the way, idea that the roles can be flipped exists in a lot of societies. Even in America, we have the idea of tomboys, right? Girls who grow up very much in a masculine role, but then transition back into more feminine ones in adulthood. In Persia, there's the basha pash, or girls dressed up as boys. In Afghanistan, they stereotypically can maintain these roles in adulthood. There are eunuchs in a number of cultures. And of course, even in modern society, there have been great pressures to try to bring up children in gender-neutral ways, to purge blue and pink. Of course, the colors of those were historically flipped at some point. The Romans would have thought of pink as a male color, but nevertheless, the idea of gender-neutral upbringing. But what happens to a society that, as a whole, that genuinely doesn't know what a child's biological sex might be. That might seem like an impossibility, but it does in fact exist in the condition of 5-alpha reductase deficiency. So 5-alpha reductase is an enzyme that converts testosterone into its much more potent form of dihydroxytestosterone. So when a male child is young, there's fairly little testosterone circulating around before puberty. So the principal developer of male development is in fact 5-hydroxytestosterone. So if this converting enzyme is not there, even though there is testosterone, the hormone that would drive male development, that would actually cause penis to develop, the male shape to generally appear, is not present, but the testicles still are. So when puberty hits, now all of a sudden there's massively more testosterone around. And even if you don't convert that to its more active form, it's now enough to drive male development. And basically a child will essentially appear female and be raised as a female until puberty. And then all of a sudden that child will sprout a penis and start growing hair and look male. So, these societies that have the possibility for this will necessarily raise children in a much more neutral way, because they really don't know biologically whether a child is going to turn out to be a boy or a girl until much later in life. Now, this condition of 5-hydroxytestosterone, or that deficiency, the ability to form 5-hydroxy deficiency, is really concentrated in two populations in the world: in the Dominican Republic and in a portion of New Guinea. And in the Dominican Republic, they're called
Guavadoses.
And this is, by the way, a traditionally very masculine, macho culture. And we think of girls and boys are often actually divided, so they're still gender-biased upbringing, but they can swap. They're brought up as girls, looking like girls. They're raised as girls. And their masculine emergency is fraught with difficulties. There was a BBC article, which I'm going to look at for a second here, that described the experiences of one such child who went through this. Johnny, once known as Felicia, remembers going to school in a little red dress, though he says he was never happy doing girl things. I never liked to dress as a girl, and when they brought me toys for girls, I never bothered playing with them. When I saw a group of boys, I would stop to play ball with them. When he became obviously male, Johnny now was taunted at school and responded with his fists. Quote, "They used to say I was a devil, nasty things, bad words, and I had no choice but to fight them because they were crossing the line." So in this society, despite popping up later, again, upbringing is not gender neutral, but people could switch, and it implies that biology tends to drive things more than society, than the socialization in terms of identity. But in New Guinea, they had a much more gender-neutral upbringing. Despite this, even in New Guinea, which provides as neutral a gender upbringing as possible, it is still stereotypically the men who fulfill the role of warrior and hunter in the society, and often as chief as well. So it would imply that the socialization definitely shapes people, but we can't beat biology entirely, even with entirely gender-neutral upbringing. Even with the modern examples, again, of Norway, Finland, again, it's been pointed out that to some extent when women are offered more freedom, that they tend to fall less into professional roles that are stereotypically male, because they don't have to, but maybe they can embrace what makes them happy. But nevertheless, it also shows that culture can shape these things, that there is something in our psychology that is inherent in our upbringing, and it does put us towards particular roles, that we can be shaped into a warrior or a king. We can be shaped into particular jobs, particular professions through this process of feedback. And that this is perhaps what gives masculinity a particular portion of its childhood, that you're reinforcing those biological ideas that, again, that that you have to earn something, but that you may fall behind and be excluded from society in that regard, that there is a constant process of feedback. Now, in terms of the importance of nature versus nurture, we look at things across the board, and the answer is almost always that it is a blend of things. There is no human behavior that is entirely driven by biology, with the possible exception of maybe some infant reflexes, things like the fact that an infant will scratch their hand, will grab, like the monkey falling out of the tree, or holding your breath underwater as an infant. But beyond that, once socialization kicks in, behaviors are modifiable, but that these societal roles are often reinforcing of those that were inherently biological. So again, even in the Dominican Republic, a place where they don't even know if the children are going to be biologically male or female, that these macho cultures still develop. And again, if we look at cross culture, how strong is one over the other? It really varies. There are things that we think of as being pretty dang biological. I mentioned, for example, one that affects me, or I work with a lot in psychiatry, is that we look at trying to stop people from committing suicide. And in the United States, that is a phenomenon that is overwhelmingly male in terms of completed suicide. We know that men are more likely, are less likely to attempt suicide, but are much more likely to complete, to the point that now that men, for every attempt, a man is 4 times as likely to end up dead as a woman. And that appears across a lot of cultures, so we think of that as being biological and linked to aggression, but it's not universal. So in China, accounts for a lot of the world's population, right? So pretty big exception, women are more likely to commit suicide. So even in something that we think of being as really driven by a lot of inherent aspects of aggression, of something as being biological, perhaps linked to testosterone, lifespan is another one that fits into this. Again, men live shorter in most parts, but not if they got all the good stuff. So society still shapes this, which means, again, if we choose an aspect of masculinity that we think is more positive, that it can be used to shape our behavior and our thinking. And then again, it's not just for males in this, that shellback tradition, whether you view it as positive or negative, an aspect of the patriarchy, or a positive way of shaping sailors, nevertheless can help shape people into these more hardened individuals, does form a particular sense of bonding and hierarchy. So the question comes, if we can do this, if society allows us to shape even things that are biologically determined, should we? And that's what we're going to get to next, is the positives and the negatives, and just what are the differences in how men and women behave and act. Tune in. Thanks.